I'm very excited to have here with us tonight Adaeze Cadet and Dana McKinney. And I met Adaeze maybe 2 years ago in actually in an AIA powerful event where we had there was a discussion happening in an architecture office in LA, and we briefly chatted, and we engaged in this very good conversation. And more recently, I had the chance to see Dana's work. She was presenting her work in another lecture, and I was also very fascinated by her work, her thesis, and also her work, the work that she's been doing at Gary Partners. Oh, actually, I forgot to say a few things regarding house rules. So my name is we are recording this section, and we are recording on speaker mode. So anybody who is going to be speaking, so we ask everybody to have your phones on mute, because otherwise the camera keeps switching. Also, we are recording so that everybody's okay if you have your image there. Also, we're going to be having Adaeze and Dana presenting, and then we're going to be having some minutes for like half an hour presenting for each of them, and then we're going to have hopefully we're going to engage in a good you guys going to have questions, and we're going to engage in a good conversation. I think this is a good opportunity to have a good conversation. My name is Luciana Varculja. I'm the Advocacy Chair from AWA+D. Like I mentioned, we are very excited here to have Adaeze and Dana to come by to talk to us. So this first open mic, for the past months, we saw a wave of protests across the nation and across the globe asking for the end to racial injustice and police brutality. All sectors and organizations are being challenged to reflect upon equity and inclusion. In the architecture field, known as being predominantly shaped by white males, we are questioning how systematic racism is embedded in our profession. Through its Advocacy Series Open Mic 1, AWA+D invites Dana McKinney and Adaeze Cadet to share their work in the field and their vision on how they are using their experience as a mentor, as an academic, and as an architect to advance diversity in the profession. From a very young age, Adaeze Cadet had a passion for architecture and design, and as she was completing her Master of Architecture, she began working at HKS, where she honed her creativity to design beautiful, functional, and sustainable buildings. She has more than 14 years of experience in working in all phases of architecture, focusing on hospitality, high-rise residential, and mixed-use sectors. In addition to being a licensed architect and a lead AP with BD+C specialty, Adaeze is a member of the HKS LA Design Fellowship Committee, an HKS Sustainable Champion, and a Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Council member. She believes that architecture should not only function for the client and end users, but it should also enhance the community that surrounds it. She also runs her own fashion line, House of LVA. Dana McKinney is an architect and urban planner who is an outspoken advocate for social justice and equity through design. Dana centralizes people and their broader communities through her work. Her academic and professional work integrates wellness, policy, and economics into innovative design solutions to benefit even the most vulnerable populations, including formerly incarcerated individuals, persons experiencing homelessness, and the elderly. Dana graduated from Princeton University summa cum laude with an AB in architecture and completed her master's in architecture and urban planning, both with distinction at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, GSD. During her time at the GSD, Dana helped to establish the inaugural Black in Design Conference, Map the Gap, and the African American Design Nexus. We are very excited to have you both here, sharing your stories, your experience in the field, and the mic is yours. So Adaeze, if you wanna start sharing your presentation with us, that would be great.
Okay, thank you for that lovely introduction. 1 second here. Okay, so I will continue that introduction and talk a little bit about me. I'm from Sacramento, California. I'm a twin, which you could spot in the crowd there. My father is from Haiti. I grew up in an upper middle class family, and we've been traveling abroad ever since I was young. As a kindergartner, I used to organize other kids to build a playhouse out of blocks at recess. And then as I got older, I would rearrange the furniture at home and beg my mom to take me to open houses. So at the age of 9, it was no surprise to my family that I declared I wanted to become an architect. It's also very important to note that Legos are still very much my happy place. For college, I took a big leap, left California, and went to Philadelphia University. During my time there, I had to deal with professors who didn't offer me the same level of support they did to other students. But thankfully, I had the support of outside critics. During my 3rd year, I looked up and realized I was the only Black student left in my year. I had become where I wanted to go to school for my master's because for my parents, as far as they were concerned, a master's was a minimum. And I came across Prairie View A&M University, which is an HBCU right outside of Houston, Texas. I transferred into their 5-year combined BS master's program in architecture, and I got the support I needed to grow my design chops, and it was really a life-changing experience to be surrounded by people that looked like me, who loved architecture as much as I did. As I started working at HKS at their headquarters in Dallas, I enjoyed it, but then I missed California, so I transferred to the San Francisco office where I had the pleasure of designing their current office, which you can see in those middle 2 pictures. Then I transferred to the Los Angeles office. During that time, I picked up a few letters after my name and became a licensed architect. I've been with HKS for 15 years now, and currently I'm a vice president in the hospitality studio. I worked on the West Hollywood Edition Hotel out here in California, and you can see in the bottom 2 pictures, representation of that project, the Edition Hotel. And then in the upper right is a picture of a Santa Monica retail building that is currently in the design phase. And then I also worked on the Robertson Lane Hotel that you can see in the upper left picture. As I also serve as a sustainability champion in our Los Angeles office, a Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Council member for the firm, and I also am on the HKS LA Design Fellowship Committee. And through that fellowship, we reach out to community colleges and universities in architecture and help engage with the students and get them excited about architecture. Now I'm going to talk to you about empathy in design, what it looks like at HKS, and what it means for our industry. So here we have 4 public housing projects that look very similar, except the 2 on the left are prisons. For far too long, architects have been designing buildings in low-income and marginalized communities with no regard for the people that inhabit these spaces. We should be approaching every project with the same level of empathy and design rigor that we reserve for the quote-unquote right clients in the right neighborhoods. We should take the time to learn about the communities we build in, understand the user needs, set sustainability goals, and marry that with our client's vision. It's time to rethink the way we practice architecture and embed these one-time extras into the way we approach every project. To do this, we start by infusing empathy in our designs. At HKS, we do this through our responsible design framework. In it, we clearly define the project stakeholders, follow a clear process, and understand the project site through the nature of place study. Our responsible design framework uses a thoughtful approach driven by systems thinking. It's deliberate, integrative, and innovative. We engage as thinking partners, establish guiding principles with performance targets, and deliver impact by achieving these targeted outcomes. The 5 key stakeholders are the community that surrounds the project, the client and or user that interacts with the project, the earth because, well, duh, the co-creators, which encompass the traditional project team, and the client and capital who covers the cost of the project and may or may not be the user as well. These key stakeholders play a critical role in decision-making throughout the entire design process. It's important to understand their point of view, individual goals and concerns, and their desired outcomes. The process of responsible design starts with establishing a transparent studio to allow for critical thinking and team communication. Then we set guiding principles define the project's impact through alignment workshops and integrative design. We add value as thinking partners, providing research to define, design, and deliver the best design solution for all stakeholders. The next key component to designing with empathy at HCAS is what we call the nature of place. Through research, the goals are to reveal the unique character of the site, to seek holistic design solutions, and to collaborate, integrate, and craft a shared purpose. Here is an example of what it looks like for a project we did in Austin, Texas. We studied the site through the lens of these 7 categories, 3 of which I will expand on in the following slides. The neighborhood fabric category addresses the site's adjacencies and extends to the community scale. We look for answers to questions like these. What are the opportunities to provide value to the community beyond the property line? And how are people likely to be arriving at the site? The energy and carbon section focuses on ways to shift the cultural dependency on dirty energy to renewable energy options that are more sustainable, plus ways to counteract emissions. For power, we ask, what are the appropriate energy use intensity targets for this building? And are we achieving these technologies and strategies, and what active technologies and strategies should be considered to reduce energy consumption of the building? Under waste and recycling, what would be the appropriate approach or protocol to address recycling? And is it possible to manage waste on-site to achieve waste diversion goals? Looking at renewable energy, are there incentives available to subsidize on-site renewable energy production? And how feasible are these options for on-site renewable energy? Every community is made up of people of different backgrounds. It's important to think about the present needs of each group and identify where inequities exist and how they may be addressed through holistic design. In this category, we look at population to understand what specific links to the community need to be considered or enhanced, and how will these needs change as the population grows. Under social demographics, we research if there are opportunities to tap into or provide services that could improve education or other social initiatives. We ask, should the building consider any demographic shifts in the near future? When looking at economic demographics, we look for opportunities to tap into or provide services that would improve the economic development of the community. Now I'm going to show you a project where we embedded empathy into the design. This is the Robertson Lane Hotel. It's located in West Hollywood, California, near the corner of Robertson and Santa Monica Boulevards. It will be a 9-story, 225-key hotel with ground floor retail going for LEED Gold. The challenge was to design a project that ties the neighborhood together by breaking down the scale of the city blocks and enhancing the pedestrian connections while activating the streetscape. We did this by introducing a mid-block pedestrian lane through the core of the site. This lane creates a pedestrian experience not currently found in the area. This will be the first piece in a larger vision to connect multiple blocks together and encourage foot traffic throughout the neighborhood. Not only will this help to foster a stronger sense of community, but it will also improve retail sales for the tenant, as well as increase the value of the lease space. The challenge was, went the wrong way. To define the project's impact on the earth, we started with an alignment workshop called an eco-charrette during the schematic design phase to establish the project's sustainability goals. Based on the current energy model, the project has an EUI of 55.6 and demonstrates a 52% savings over CBEC's 2003 EUI baseline. The project is also considering incorporating a 72 kilowatt solar PV array that could provide 2.9% of the building's energy. Another important element to this site is the factory building. Through our Nature of Place study, we learned this key role that the building played within the neighborhood. Built in 1929 for the Mitchell Camera Company, this prefabricated industrial building was used to manufacture motion picture cameras. In the 70s and 80s, it became the world famous club known as Studio One, and today it remains an important icon in the LGBTQ+ community. Through consulting with the preservation community, we proposed rotating the factory building along Robertson Boulevard, making it a prominent element that would feature a commemorative space telling the the history and the significance of the building. So you can see here on the bottom left, the building in its current orientation, perpendicular to Robertson Boulevard. And then in the upper right, you can see in the rendering how we were going to disassemble it, rotate it 90 degrees, reassemble it, so that the long face is now parallel with Robertson Boulevard. Due to the prefab nature of the factory building, we can disassemble it, restore it back to its original glory, and then reassemble it in its new location. We are also adapting the factory shell to perform as an energy efficient enclosure by integrating a system of shop fabricated panels behind the existing metal panels. And this will create an energy efficient building and also improve the thermal comfort of the occupants. So here are some renderings of the final design. In this view, which is taken from Lapeer Drive, you can see on the left how we tucked away the drop-off area under the guest room tower, and it's next to the centrally located hotel with outdoor dining that's up on the level 2 area. Here you can see how the glass lobby helps to activate the streetscape and how the lane invites people into the site. In this view, looking down Robertson Boulevard, you can see the new prominence of the factory building and the way we broke down the scale of this large project to better suit the surrounding neighborhood. The main portion of the guest room facade is a mix between 8 feet by 11 feet gigantic vision panels with spandrel glazing. These large panels offer the guests access to daylight and expansive views in the surrounding area. And lastly, this is a view of the overall site. You can see how the lane connects with the West Hollywood Park and cuts through the site to improve pedestrian experience, and how the factory building is now celebrated and creates a gateway into the project. By following the responsible design framework, we were able to design a project that is infused with empathy for all stakeholders. It is truly connected to the community and celebrates its history. It creates a unique experience for the users, reduces the strain on the earth, and achieves the needs of the client. As we continue to apply this framework to future projects, we can bring this level of design thinking to all of the communities we serve, no matter the budget, social and economic status, or racial makeup. Thank you.
Thank you, Adaeze. This is great, and I'm hoping, I cannot see the chat, so I'm checking with Alejandra when we're gonna be able to have questions. I'm hoping that people there are getting excited to have questions and engage in the conversation with Adaeze and Dana. So no, I'm not gonna shut up. Dana, do you wanna go for it?
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Before I start presenting, I would just want to kind of give you guys a little bit of insight into me as a designer. I was raised in a small town in Connecticut called Trumbull. Think very upper middle income, very, very really white town. But I would spend my Sunday afternoons and evenings with my grandparents and relatives in Newark, New Jersey, which is a predominantly Black and brown community about 9 miles outside of Manhattan. The juxtaposition of these two very discrete environments very heavily shaped my understanding of the world, of cities, of suburbia, and it really inspired me to become a designer. I remember when I was maybe like 11 or 12 years old, I was really upset by seeing like the gum all over the streets of downtown Newark. I was like, I'm gonna write Cory Booker a letter, who at the time was the mayor, about like, you guys have to clean up the streets, but of course it's much more than that. And at the same time, I saw the value of a beautiful environment with beautiful housing and parks and schools and other institutional facilities. And so I eventually moved on to go to Princeton for my undergrad, where I studied architecture, where I could not have had a better environment for me at that time in my life. Princeton is very high, pie in the sky, you can do whatever you want sort of environment. And when it came time for me to look for a graduate program to pursue architecture and urban planning, I quickly realized that that wasn't gonna necessarily be the case. Once I actually got to the GSD, where I eventually went to school, it also became very apparent that people like myself, Black and brown people, tend to not have a lot of representations in spaces of design. At the time when I started the program, there was maybe about 70 people in my incoming class, of which I was one of 2 Black women. In my graduating class, in which you have several other groups of people joining you as you go along, was about 120 people, and I was the only woman of color to graduate in that class from the US. And so similar to Adaeze, there was a kind of diminishing level of color in the class as we went along. And so the work that I'm going to present to you guys is my graduate thesis, and it's kind of my love letter to the cities and the communities that brought me to design, and it's a response also to a really deep social issue. So let me just share my screen. Okay, can you guys see it okay? Okay. So the thing I wanted to target in my thesis was incarceration. At the time when I was in graduate school, if you ask any of my friends, we were extremely heavily involved with organizations like Black Lives Matter, the NAACP. Around 2015, there was a ton of protests. I used to joke with my parents that I was like a part-time activist and a full-time student because I was spending so much time like doing die-ins in the street. And around the same time, there was a petition going around nationally within the architecture community about asking architects to refuse to design spaces of torture. The previous iteration of it was to no longer design prisons at all. And I always thought to myself that prisons were the one environment I myself wanted to have no interactions with whatsoever once I kind of jumped into the professional world. And so when it came to my thesis, I said, you know what, why not? Try to address an issue that I have a really hard time understanding, having a hard time grasping, and also look at something that I don't think typically has a very strong response by designers. Let's see. Okay. So just for definition's sake, I just wanted to introduce the word system impacted people or person. A lot of times people use inmate or the criminal, and that's not the type of language I would like to use today. A person that is system impacted isn't just the person who's been formally incarcerated, but it also includes their family members, their loved ones, their community. And it's a broader understanding that the person that has been accused of a crime or convicted of a crime isn't the only one that's affected by that crime or by that accusation. I just want to quickly go through a history of what incarceration and design has come from. So in 1791, Jeremy Bentham created the concept of the panopticon, and it was an idea of surveillance. And so the circular plan was basically filled with cells, and in the middle there was a tower for surveillance for different guards to look in. The idea also was that if a guard wasn't in that central tower, that the inmates or the people that were inside the facility would actually be able to watch one another. Shortly thereafter, in 1818, the Auburn prison was built. And this was the first prison in the US that was really about retribution and about making your life as miserable, basically, as it possibly could have been. And around the same time as that, in 1829, Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia was built. This was one of the first ones that really looked at sort of a rehabilitative model. However, their version of rehabilitation was based off of solitary confinement, so it actually ended up causing inverse of that very often. And today, there's more than 7.3 million people between incarceration, so that includes prisons and jails, and community supervision, so probation and parole. This is an example of an overcrowded facility in California, where it's open housing. And conversely, you have things like this, which would be a closed cell. I think this is probably an example of a maximum security facility, which is typically a 5-foot by 8-foot space. You can't design spaces to address incarceration without understanding the legacy of it. And so I did a deep dive, this is also a very condensed version, to look at what were the sort of historical events that caused incarceration to take up so much in the United States. The main things were kind of the war on drugs, the war on crime, the Sentencing Reform Act. There was a whole bunch of ongoing criminal justice reforms from the 1970s on that really caused a pretty tremendous increase over time. The prison population is broken down into these different categories. The main thing is state prisons. A lot of people tend to think that drug offenses is actually the largest offense that covers the kind of the wheel of incarceration. It's predominantly violent offenses. And then some of these numbers are a little bit older, I think from 2015. So the juvenile number has actually gone down quite significantly. There's been a really big push among criminal justice advocates to get children out of facilities. And then the other, which would include detaining of immigrant populations, that's skyrocketed since this number had come out. I may not need to say this, but incarceration dramatically or disproportionately affects people of color, predominantly Black and brown men and women. The statistics for Black women specifically are rising further than any other population. And so that's something that criminal justice advocates are kind of keeping an eye on and kind of understanding why that's happening and also the repercussions of that happening. And just to kind of throw in a few examples of what incarceration doesn't need to be. This is Halden Prison in Norway, in Halden, Norway. It's actually a facility I went to last year to visit. It is a maximum security prison in Norway, which has a sort of campus mentality. Everybody has their own room. You're called a client. No one's an inmate. No one's incarcerated. There's common spaces and communal kitchens and religious spaces, a podcast studio. You can get any level of education that you want because that's what the government entitles you to do. And everybody in this facility has a maximum sentence of 21 years. So you can be the worst sort of mass murderer or serial killer, you're out in 21 years. And the idea behind this is that everybody is worthy of rehabilitation, everybody is worthy of a life outside of this institution, and that you, just like anybody else, have a life that's worthy. And that's a very different sort of mentality, whereas in our country, you can have multiple life sentences. This is another one in Norway called Astoy Minimum Security Prison. It was actually formerly a summer camp for boys, and the Norwegian government purchased it. It's an island. There are no gates, there are no walls. The idea is that if you really want freedom, you can go make your try and swim away. May or may not work. And everyone just lives in cabins and they work the land. They have a sheep farm. It's very open and beautiful. And this is a facility in Ontario, Canada for women. And it's kind of using a duplex housing model in which women who are incarcerated are actually invited to bring their families with them so that they aren't disconnected. There's a lot of studies that have shown that women who've been removed from the family and put into states of incarceration often, because they are so much the breadwinners for their families, it destabilizes the family structure. And so the Canadian government realized this and very quickly started building facilities like this so that women can have their children with them or their spouses with them. And then the kids can go to a local school right outside of the facility. So in 2017, I had the option of doing my thesis, and I really wanted to create sort of the anti-prison or the alternative to prison that would be humane and just. And I wanted to cite it somewhere that was familiar to me. So I selected Newark, New Jersey, known as the Brick City. You can kind of, it's the big blob in orange. It's pretty close to Manhattan to kind of give everybody a frame of reference. The reason why I chose Newark is because of my mother and my mother's siblings. One's actually missing from this picture, but 3 of them are here. And they grew up on this house on Chancellor Ave, which is now where my uncle and my aunt live now. And coming here, it was kind of like a little bubble within the city of Newark because it was tree lined and there was a park nearby, but just a few blocks over in either direction and you're very much part of the more traditional Newark fabric, which is disenfranchised, divested, often bars in the windows and sort of the sort of prototypical example of public housing that's in disrepair. The city of Newark boomed really quickly in terms of population. It kind of coincided with the development of Manhattan and served as a sister city to Manhattan, but it became a very large immigrant population in which it was highly segregated. But with the Great Migration of Blacks coming from the South, meeting the segregation of all these different European ethnic groups, the city became even further segregated by redlining practices. And in 1967, the city underwent a series of race riots, which basically destabilized the city overnight and caused a significance of white flight from it. So you can kind of see here again, trying to understand what this legacy is. After the race riots in the late 60s, the predominantly white population just left. And with that was extreme divestment of the city itself. And today, Newark residents have a 1 in 4 lifetime likelihood of being incarcerated. So if you just let that sit for a second, that is insane. There's a 25% chance if you're from the city, you're gonna go to prison or jail. And so the question I wanted to ask myself was, can we provide an alternative to lessen recidivism through places of reconciliation and rehabilitation, or reviving the broader community at large? The reason why recidivism was kind of a target idea for me was because incarceration, at least the American style, isn't effective. Right now, with the 7.3 million people who are stuck in this system, there's a 75% chance they're gonna go back in the system within 5 years. So in my mind, that's unacceptable, especially when it costs on average $80,000 a year to send somebody to prison, and for a child, upwards of $125,000 per year. And actually, fun fact, or not so fun fact, in the state of Connecticut, there's only about 40 children that are currently in the detention facility. So the cost of that per child is about $1 million per child. So the village, a restorative community as an inoculation for recidivism. I wanted to build it on a site that was an existing site and had a legacy within the city. So this is Baxter Terrace. Downtown is kind of in the bottom right-hand corner of the image. And Baxter Terrace was the first public housing project within the city of Newark. It was actually a integrated site. So it had floors, a black floor, white floor, black floor, white floor for the 4-story sections. And in the early 2000s, it was vacated and torn down in the early 2010s. In the project, I basically wanted to confront all these different physical and emotional and unspoken attributes of the existing system and flip it on its head with these other sort of adjectives. And for me, it's not just about rehabilitation or retribution, it's also about restoration, because I think that the issues of incarceration are so deeply entrenched in the community that it is something that needs to be repaired within the community-wide scale. The thesis really worked on a 3-part model. The rehabilitative part, which was restorative justice, which is an alternative way to adjudicate crimes. Security through housing. A lot of times when people are leaving spaces of incarceration, they are housing insecure. And empowerment, so looking at places of employment, as well as amenities, because people have to recreate. So the nitty-gritty of the architecture, this was just the ground floor plan of the facility. The site was pretty big, and right now it's one large parcel, and it was really important for me to continue the street grid all the way through to make it more porous for everybody and to make it feel more ingrained as part of the existing building fabric. And on the outside, I really wanted it to feel kind of like a prototypical street where there's ground floor shops with residential above. But as you go inside the site, there's sort of an eradication of that sort of prototypical environment. Within the ground floor, one of the things that was really important to me with looking at places of employment and amenities was to identify employers that don't have the checkbox that acknowledges that you have been convicted of a felony charge or have been sentenced of a crime. That checkbox for so many people is basically an elimination altogether from a potential place of employment. And so I did a little bit of research and started calling companies and trying to find out which were the ones that had already gone through the process and gotten rid of that box. I'll talk to you a little bit more about these other words in a few minutes. So this is one of the residential plans. As you go up the buildings, there's a series of different types of housing units, some which are more single family, so they may be 2, 3, 4 bedroom units, multi-generational family units, so up to 6 or 7 bedroom units, as well as singles, so studio apartments and single room occupancy apartments, and then some co-living spaces. Everybody who is coming in and out of the system have different circumstances, and I wanted to create environments that were flexible for those different family structures as well as people's needs. And then as you go further up, there's another sort of typology of unit. So again, I didn't really want this to look like much from the outside. I wanted it to fit in with the brick atmosphere of Newark. One thing I did was whitewash the bricks, because I'm not the biggest fan of bricks, and that was my thesis advisor's suggestion to make me more comfortable with it. But it was just the kind of the idea that you can approach this and you wouldn't really think very much of it from the outside. Once you enter the site, though, you enter into a public promenade where you really start to insert spaces of landscape, and there's more natural materials. And so kind of creating an ecology that isn't necessarily native to that part of the city. There is an amphitheater within it, recognizing that it's really important to have spaces of recreation and celebration. So kind of a view of that. And also a multi-purpose room. When I spoke to a lot of residents in the area during one of my trips down there, I would ask people like, oh, where do you have like a party? And if it wasn't in their backyard, there wasn't really anything local that people really were excited about that would hold 100, 200 people. Also, a lot of times we have like community meetings in the neighborhood. They're in like auditoriums of schools that may or may not be in the best shape. And so I wanted to create a space that could be used for kind of like events that are celebratory as well as more day-to-day activities. And so also creating something that was beautiful and sleek within the site. One thing, whenever I see this particular image, it reminds me of cutting out figures in architecture with the availability of cutout people. A lot of them are white. And so I had to spend some time with some friends cutting out people of color. There's Blue Ivy and Beyonce kind of coming down on the way over there. And then the last component was the restorative justice. So restorative justice is a practice that comes from Indigenous communities throughout the country. It's the idea of bringing together the offender of that person accused of a crime with the victim of the crime, as well as community members. In its most rudimentary form, it might be about 3 or 4 people sitting in a circle. Sometimes there's literally like a talking stick, and you literally go through and talk through what happened, why the crime had happened, did the person accept the responsibility for the crime, what can be done to mend the relationship between the victim and that person accused of the crime. And it's a very, very restorative practice, not just for the person who's been accused, but for the victim and the community members who participate. Right now, throughout the country, there are different systems of justice that are starting to implement it, especially for juveniles who've been involved in the system, as well as low-grade nonviolent offenders. But it's something that is really great in terms of recidivism. Typically, people who participate in restorative justice practices only recidivize about 20 to 30%. And so it's a much more effective practice in getting people to kind of get back on their feet, as well as kind of come to terms with the reality of their crime, or of kind of the reality that they live in at large. And what I wanted to do was create a series of spaces within the broader plan where you could have different restorative justice practices. Some that were really small, again, for like the 4 or 5 people, some that can hold a group of 25, 30 people. So I'm just gonna walk you through, I think about 4 of them right now. There's, I think, 8 in total. So this was just the labyrinth, in which there's a sunken room in which you sit around a series of glass walls and very thin pillars. The hilltop, and so this is the smallest one, and it was the idea that you can kind of be sunken again within space, within a very small, intimate group of people overlooking the tree canopy beyond. I really wanted to create spaces that were kind of foreign to this environment in general, and even more foreign to everything else within the site. And so they're really kind of small and protected within the site. This is the walls. And so this is a fully exteriorized restorative justice space, about 16 people. And the idea behind this one was to create sort of an ephemeral gallery space that would be a series of concrete and brick walls that you could have muralists come in and do installations. And so it would in part serve as a gallery, in part serve as a restorative justice space. And then the flower field. One of the things that I always think of when I think of Newark is my grandparents' garden in the backyard, and just like this presence of flower, also in the front yard too, but this presence of flowers in their home, and how warm it made the house feel, and that there's not a lot of spaces like that in the city. So I wanted everyone to feel like this presence of the bloom in spring. And so here's the flower field in which you're kind of submerged within these wildflowers around you. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Adaeze. This was, thank you for sharing your work. This was great. I have a few questions. I have a few things for us to talk about, but I also want to open up to questions, right? To the Q&A or the chat if you guys want to post questions, but I cannot see. So Alejandra, I don't know if you can see from your end if there is anything coming up right now or.
Yeah, so actually we were having a little technical difficulty with the chat. So what I'm going to do is we can do some questions from you, Luciana, first, and then open it up to people, and I'll stop recording. So if anyone has any issues with being recorded, you won't be recorded. So you can just like speak out your question. Okay, sounds good. So, well, it's kind of, I think there are so many things during both presentations, right? And I think you both shared a little bit of your personal stories of coming in to the field, living in a neighborhood, experiencing different things, right? And then coming up to school and sensing that something was different, right? Something was off in terms of, you see that there were not many like you there, right? And I do also have questions that are, I'm just kind of very curious, and I'm sure that I'm hoping that the audience from this conversation is also, and I think maybe some of you might also have experienced that. So I think my question comes from, you talk a little bit about how in school, right, you're feeling that there was a sense of inclusion or not, but I also am kind of curious to understand from school and then to workplace, right? And I think Adaeze, you showed some of the work that you've been producing at HKS. I think Dana, she was mostly focused on her thesis from school. But I kind of wonder from how you sensed, right, from school now to workplace, because we cannot deny talking about how we have to get to be more diverse, right, in architecture field. And how I'm sure that all of us who are in the field, we can sense that our workplace definitely lacks diversity, right? So I'm kind of just wondering, with everything that was happening also in this past months, how you potentially sense how you could go back to work, right? And then shift your mind to be working, focusing on your work, back in the office, recognizing that you might be in an environment that also doesn't embrace inclusion or diversity. So I'm kind of just jumping. I'm not even going straight to your what you presented as project, but I'm kind of just also curious in terms of talking about architectural environment, right, for workplace, from what you potentially experiencing in school and then coming to offices, or architecture offices. I'm just kind of wondering, even if you feel that you might be a voice in your office, I think we went through so many things happening lately in public space regarding social justice, right? We have so many things happening right now. How can you shift back to work when so many things are happening around it? I don't know if that makes sense, the question. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that. I'm jumping straight into more of a conversation that I also want to trigger with you both in here tonight.
Yeah, so I think kind of starting with the first part of your question, going from school to the workplace. For me, while I was in school, you know, similar to Dana's experience, as you were going up through the years, you realize there are fewer and fewer people that look like you that surround that same space. And I realized that I wasn't getting the same level of attention that my other classmates were getting, and dealing with professors that are telling me like, oh, this isn't right, and me doubting and questioning my work. And then it'd be a pin-up, and the people would come from outside and look at it and be like, wow, that's amazing. And so I'm like, okay, so I'm starting to understand that there's bias here and I'm not being supported. And that kind of pushed me to make a conscious choice to then go to an HBCU, because I did also realize that when I enter into the profession, it is very much a white male dominated profession. And I wanted to try to, be around people who looked like me, thought like me, so I could feel more inclusive. So I purposely made that shift to gain that camaraderie and friendship. And a lot of my friends I'm still, that I went to Prairie View A&M with, I still talk to. And so I wanted to get that foundation and have to have that support. It would have been nice to not need that, but I kind of already knew what was happening. So then when I started working at HKS, it is not, it's probably about average of a large firm in terms of diversity numbers. It's not really one way or the other. And I definitely felt like I was kind of left out, and like realized after my first year, I thought, well, maybe it's because I'm new. But then once new people started coming behind me, I realized like, oh, well, why is he going to the meeting and I'm not, but I have one more year of experience and a master's degree. So there are moments like that where you're like, wait, what is happening? And so you start to realize that, like, the environment is rooted in a white male upper class. That's how the profession started. So there are those roots there, but I am starting to see a shift, even in school, like more women being in our profession, which was great to see in school. And I think that is starting to translate. So it is shifting, but it's something that we just have to be advocates for and help to push them. And I'm constantly challenging HKS. I sit on the Jedi Council and I'm like, hey guys, we need to check that or check this. And so I kind of try to take it up on myself to do that and also be a role model to help other, women of color, especially in architecture.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if I fully answered that question. But.
Yeah, no, I think we're getting to more of that discussion tonight. So thank you, Adaeze. I think it's a good. That was great. I think it was curious to hear a little bit more about that. So, what about you, Dana? Do you wanna share?
Yeah, I think my educational experiences were so different from one another. When I was doing my undergrad, I felt like I never really felt my race, because I think Princeton was like hyper diverse, and they cut a section of every single diverse group exactly across the entire campus. And so you just didn't necessarily feel that as much. But then when I got to the GSD, I was literally met with comments about like, you are lucky to be here because of affirmative action. And so that was like an immediate, like, what? Excuse me. And so I think from that experience, to transition into the workplace wasn't that difficult, and if anything, it only went up from the workplace. And I think similar to Adaeze, like I kind of made a community to get me through that moment. And like our school was not diverse. When I started the GSD, there was about 900 students and maybe 7 or 8 Black students. I became friends with basically all of them. And as time went on, our population of Black and Brown students increased a little bit. And those people became like my ride or dies in that experience. I literally have a text group of 8 Black and 1 Latina, who we literally talk every day through professional decision making, through like personal things, romantic issues, the whole gambit. And those women, actually one of whom is on the call, I think Tessa Kanene, and I think those women especially were super supportive, and we became each other's family to kind of get us through to the next phase. And then once I got to the workplace, I think also very similarly, you start noticing like, oh, why is that white boy going in the conference room? Or why are they getting talked to? And someone else has to talk to me to talk to somebody to talk to me. And I felt like to kind of put my foot in the door into the conference room and get talked to, I had to really put myself out there and make connections that I don't think is typical for most people who work in my office, and like really put myself in a place of vulnerability to be seen. But at that point, I think I was so used to it, given my experience at the GSD, that it didn't really feel like that much work. It was just part of the process. It's like as soon as I acknowledged that was going to have to happen, I just did what I had to do to get to the door.
Thank you for sharing that. So I do have a question more related to architecture, and then I can open the mic to everybody else out there. It's interesting, I think, from Adaeze's works, right? When you mentioned the hotel, when you were trying to, right, you guys opened that street and it's funny how both the projects, right, had somehow that attempt to break the massing
and I might have no architects on the call, and I don't want to be too technical here to talk about architecture, but I think we all are users of the city, right? Or on this call, we are all users of space. So independent of having on this call an architectural background, I think what I found very interesting from looking when we, as designers, right, as architects, when you think about, and I think going specifically to Dana's project in terms of the architecture of incarceration, and then sharing with us those amazing projects of what's happened with, what is our incarceration in Norway, right? And then Sunday Man, right? Or even the woman's place being able to be with their family, right? Because there is something, I work more with housing and homeless. So when we think about people not having the sense of house, right, or home, and then there is also a sense people who are living in the street, they're not, if it's not just about giving shelter, right, but they're also feeling a sense of exclusion from society, right? So how exactly we bring that back? It's not, that's why it's not just about shelter, so how other programs and services have to be combined. So it's, I think when you talk about incarceration and having to remove people from society, and then what is exactly the space where those people would be potentially being under something that they can be reintroduced then back, right? What exactly that means when you talk about space, and how as designers we can also be designing spaces of exclusion, right? And so I'm kind of wondering how, and we can be not quite working with incarceration, right? But suddenly we can build the spaces that also exclude. So how can we, maybe we're not gonna have an answer for the question on this call, but I wonder how can we balance that, right? How can we be working in the cities, make sure, and I think because you guys sense literally that in your skin, how exactly we as designers, we are providing right now with spaces or creating potentially, how can we create more spaces that provides inclusion versus exclusion? And I know that's a very, maybe you might not be able to answer that, but I think as the point of view, we can be users of the city, but then you have another layer, right? As from where you're coming from. So I'm kind of just wondering how you sense as practitioners or as educators or mentors, how you feel that how can we design that city to think about inclusion?
I don't know, for me personally, that's part of the reason why I did the urban planning degree to supplement my architecture work. It was because I felt like even in my undergrad that architects don't think enough holistically about people, and they don't think about like the systems enough. As they think about building systems perfectly, but they don't think about social systems as they interface with the architecture. And so as I've now moved into my professional work, one of the things I'm most dedicated on is the LA River Master Plan. And I've learned the most through that process is the importance of engagement and like very honest engagement with the community. And I think that designers across the board have a responsibility and the fiduciary duty to society and the safety and wellness of society and people that use its buildings, that like they need to educate themselves on the issues that directly interface those facilities. And if you yourself can't do that education, then you need to hire somebody that does that work. And so like with the master plan, one of the issues that we're confronting on a daily basis is persons experiencing homelessness. And like, I've done a little bit of work on that space before, but I'm by no means an expert in that. So we've been working with like 5 or 6 different homelessness nonprofits, also working with the county's homelessness service authority, the cities, trying to talk to people who have been in that space before. I don't think you can formally, truly understand and design for a population, especially one that is kind of in a very vulnerable position without understanding their needs holistically. And so I just think there's a lot of education that we should be doing and that we should take it, like we should be honest with ourselves about in confronting.
Definitely.
Totally agree with what Dana's saying. And I think as architects, we have a tendency, and maybe this is some of the curse of going to school and us being our own, you know, we're our own client, we get to design wherever we want. And we have a tendency to just get really excited about a project and just dive in and have this vision in our head of what we think it's best. And we're designers and we know what's best. And we are the best at that. And we're gonna make it best. You don't know what you're doing, we're gonna do it the best way. And there's a lot of that default setting with a lot of architects, instead of taking the time to slow down, understand what you're doing, understanding the why behind what you're doing and the impacts. Like, what is this building gonna say? Like, you know, there's buildings that have these hard edges and they're very like, you know, have this big, massive wall, and that's not inviting to the community. That's not what the community needs. And the best design is when you actually understand what the community needs, understand what your user needs, and get all that synergies to happen with your design vision, and actually use that to drive what you're doing. And you know, you learn so much through discovery, through understanding and educating yourself on what you need, and also building a more diverse team. Because if you have a more diverse team, you're going to get these different perspectives, and you're going to hear, like, maybe somebody else like me will be like, well, that kind of looks like a prison. You know, like, maybe we don't want to do that for this multi-housing project. And whereas other people, you know, in a room may not, if they all look the same, regardless of what the same is, they all look the same, they're not going to get there. So you need to have that diversity of thought to help push each other to do better. And then we as architects need to slow down, understand who we're providing for, understand what the real goals are and what experience we want to create. Like you pointed out, both of us, you know, understood that we need to, in both of the projects we shared, about breaking down that scale and having that porous nature to feel like the community can come through and engage and connect with the building, and understanding that importance of that and how that shapes the design. You end up with a much better project that's doing what we want to do as designers, which is creating great spaces and shaping the community.
Thank you. Thank you, Adaeze and Dana. So I'm gonna open the mic now to anybody who wants to participate in this conversation, please.
And also, I'm gonna stop recording, so